Hello. So now that we completed iteration number 9, we move on to some enhancements. There are so many different enhancements that you can do in this project, and I will just focus on two. If you look at the mockup, one of the things you may have noticed that at the start of the game, all the buttons are dimmed. It's actually disabled. And when you are playing the game, once you start a game, the start game button is disabled. The reason for that is number one, if you keep clicking those buttons, there is action connected to them. And if the user clicks the button at the wrong time, it will repeat the same action, like it will start the game over and over and over again, or it will keep incrementing the number of answers, or indicating or checking the answer over and over and over again. So, and the other thing too, there is a design principle called the least privileged. And what that principle says that you build your software and you make sure that if the user does not need access to a certain feature, they should not have the ability to do that feature. So if when the user starts the game, the user no longer need to click the start game, they should not have the ability to click start game. Likewise, when the user hears the sound and they are ready to make a decision, once they make a selection and click one of the notes, if the user no longer need to click another note, then they should not have access to click another note. You understand that? So this is called the least privileged principle, that do not give the user access in your software to things that they do not need to access. So the first piece that I'm gonna work on in this video is the start game. How can we enable and disable the start game? And then in the next video we'll do the note buttons. There are other enhancements that you can do. For instance, we talked before about score and all of that, but the user currently hears the sound during the game only once, and they have a lot of time to answer. Like theoretically, the user can stay a whole day without answering, and the app will allow them to do that. So some enhancements could be to add a play again feature. Like when you hear the note, the random note, the user can click on a button and they hear the note again, and they kinda can add it. You may integrate that into the score. So if the user click play again, you deduct some points. So you give the one who figures it out on their own from the first time more credit than the one who click play again over and over again. The other aspect too is you may limit how long the user could have. So you can create a timer that count down maybe 10 seconds or 20 seconds for the user to answer, and you can display that for them. So once the user hears the sound, they would see a countdown from 20 down to 0, and if they do not answer by the end of the countdown, then you can move on to another game, and you can decide if you want to have a score deduction or something like that. So there's so much you can add. I will just focus now on the start game button. So I'm gonna then add two iterations here, enhancements on the start game button, and then I will add another one, enhancements on the note buttons, and we'll focus on iteration 10. So we'll say iteration 10, enable, disable the start game button, and the problem formulation. In the scope, the start game button should be enabled when a game is not being played. So at the beginning of the game, when a game ends, so this means that at the start of the game, or before a game starts, and when a game ends. But during the game, the button should be disabled. How are we going to test that? I think the testing here is straightforward. You start a game and notice that the button is no longer enabled. When a game ends, the button is enabled again. Solution formulation. The model in the data. So the data here is related to the value to set the button to enable and disable. And you can actually, I'm actually gonna think this is probably more on the view, because enabling and disabling is on the view, not really data. So in the model, no change in the model. In the view, the button needs to be enabled or disabled. So how can we do that? In order to think about this, let's visit the API documentation for the button. So if you go to Xcode and go to Window Documentation and API Reference, and you can search for a button, and if you type UIButton, which is the class that represents the buttons, you come here and there is the UIButton class reference. You can review that, and I actually mentioned this some time ago. As a beginner, you want to review the API documentation for every library that you get introduced to, because you are in the phase where you want to acquire as much information and become as familiar as possible. You want to read the API documentation. You currently never saw it before, so don't just scroll down. Take time to read the overview, to read the different options that are available, and some of it we will need. And so like here on states, some of that will be helpful, but some of it may be too much, but some may also open up your mind to new ideas and things that you can do. The button can be enabled and can be disabled, and you can see some discussion about that here, that the button is enabled or the button is not enabled. And it's the discussion on something called the states of the button. And it tells you that you can configure the states of the button and adjust the title. So a button can be enabled and disabled. So how would we know which attribute or which function to call? If you go down to symbols, that gives you a list of the variable and functions that are available in the UI button that you can use. So you want to look here for something that has to do with enabling or disabling a button. So this is to create it, configuring the button title, the button presentation, edge insets, the current state. So the current state, that is what we are looking for. But this says getting the current state, meaning you can change it. None of this allow you to change the state to be enabled or disabled. So this is not going to be it. And then getting dimensions, constants, and then it is gone. So what does ended mean? Ends mean that we did not find a function in the button that can enable it or disable. But then there is a section called relationships that tells you it inherits from UI control, meaning that, remember when we created a class, and say view controller colon UI view controller, this means that UI button is defined as class UI button colon UI control. Oops. So UI control is the superclass. Is the superclass or the base class or the class that provides the foundation for the UI button, which also means that the UI button does not only have these functions or variable, it has all the functions and variables that exist in UI control as well. So if we click on UI control, you learn about what is a UI control. There's an overview, and then if you go to symbols, you can see here is configuring the button's attribute. There is the state, and then there is the is enabled. And is enabled is a variable of a Boolean types. This is the definition of the variable, and it indicates whether the control is enabled. So let's click on that, and when you click on it, you get to more description. Here's a description what it is, and then a discussion. It says that set this value to true or false to disable. So in order to disable a button, we will need to use this value and set it to false. You can see here in the definition it says get and set, it meaning that this property or this variable is both read and has both read and write access. If there is only get, it means that it is read only. If you look at the state, you see there's only get, which means that it is a read only property. You cannot change it, but you can read it to know what it is. So the property to set a button is the is enabled, and it is not part of the UI button itself, but it's part of the UI control, which is the foundation of the UI button. So if I go back here, so we'll need to so the property we need is the is enabled property. So in the controller, we need to do that programmatically. We can't set it in Xcode because Xcode or the interface builder or the storyboard sets the properties at the beginning before you launch the app. But the button need to be enabled and disabled dynamically during the operation of the app. So in the controller, when the user, we will have, remember the controller, we describe what we need to do and the events. So what we need to do is to change the value of the is enabled. So when do we need to do that? So first, at the start, which is in the storyboard, the button will be enabled, because as you begin the app, the button needs to be enabled. Then when would it first be disabled? When the user click on it. So we'll say in the disable the button in the start game function, because that's when the user first clicks the button. That's what goes in the start game function. And then when do we enable it again? Enable the button in the end game function. We had a function when we start the game and a function when you end the game. So in the function to start the game, we will need to disable the button, meaning set this property to false. And when you enable the button, it means set that back to true. So in the solution implementation, we'll say step 1 is to add an instruction to disable the button in the start game, and then add an instruction to enable the button in the end game, and then test and commit. So let's go ahead and do that. So in the start game, well, so I don't have access to the button in the start game, right? Because the start game, the button is connected as an action, so I don't have access to it in the start game. So I need to do something else actually before all of that. I need to connect the button as an outlet to the controller so we can change its attributes. Remember, we said that an outlet connection is one that allow you to manipulate the data or the attributes of the control, and an action connection is one that allow you to connect an action. It's what the name says. So let's switch from the controller to the storyboard. I'll hide this here. And we need to switch to the view controller, and here is our start game. And in the start game, connect, drag, and connect, and we need it as an outlet. It is already connected as an action, but we also need it as an outlet, and we're gonna call it button start game. So now we have it here as an outlet. Now that we have it as an outlet, we can make the changes. So I can go to the start game, and you're gonna reset the game, and you can add it inside the reset game, or you can keep it by itself. I'm gonna keep it by itself because it's not really the definition of resetting the game, and you can either do it before or after. I'll do it before, and I'll say button start game dot is enabled equal false. So that will disable the start game button. If you leave it like that, you will never be able to enable it. You'll have to shut down the app. So the other part is the end game. I can move quickly to the end game by going to the list of function. Here is the end game, and that's my end game. And when the end game is done, need to enable the start game button. So I'll say button start game that is enabled equal to. So let's try. It's taking a few seconds here. And you will see that in addition to enabling and disabling the button, there is, not in addition, there is a default behavior when you disable the button, like it gets dimmed and you no longer can click on it. So let's see here. So here is the start game. The game started, but see what happened to the button? It is grayed out, and if you try to click on it, nothing happens. So let's play the game till the end. And if everything goes well, you notice it's now was enabled, so the button is now enabled, and you can click on it again and get a game once more to start. So that's this part. Another enhancement that can be, now that the game has started, the button says start game. You may say, well, I need to change the text on the button. So you will say, for instance, instead of start game, the button becomes like a status update. You can say now playing. So you can change the text of the button or the title on the button to something else other than a start game, and then change the text back when the start game button is enabled. Okay. So one thing you can do in this is to maybe take the button in a function and have the function receives a boolean, true or false, and then check if it is true. Then you put a list of changes to the button: title, color, status, and then if it is false, then there's a whole other changes as well. So there's so much you can do, and we'll explore the use of function and taking the enable disable into a function in the next video as we deal with the note buttons. Thank you.